The morning Maria Garrison walked up the dusty road to the Covington ranch, wearing her Sunday best and carrying a carpenter's hammer. Every ranch hand within 100 yards stopped what he was doing and stared. It was the spring of 1878 in Laramie County, Wyoming Territory, and the wind came down off the mountains cold enough to bite even through the thin cotton of her pale blue dress. The dress was not much to speak of. She had sewn it herself from a bolt of cloth she had traded for over a winter of doing laundry. But it was the finest thing she owned, and she had worn it with a kind of fierce, quiet dignity that made it look like something far grander. Her dark hair was pinned up beneath a bonnet that had seen better years. Her boots were cracked at the left toe, and in her right hand, hanging easy at her side, was a hammer with a hickory handle worn smooth from use. She had walked 4 miles to get here, not because she lacked other options. Maria Garrison had never lacked for resourcefulness. But the stage from Cheyenne had dropped her at a crossroads the evening before, and the widow Hensley who ran the boarding house in town had told her, in the firm and not unkind way of a woman who has turned away many desperate people and learned not to apologize for it, that there was no room available until Saturday at the earliest. It was Tuesday. Maria had spent one night rolled in her traveling coat beneath a cottonwood tree by the creek, listening to coyotes and counting her money and deciding what came next. What came next, she had decided, was the Covington Ranch. She had heard about it in Cheyenne. She had heard about it, in fact, before she had ever left Missouri, which was the name she gave to the flat, gray life she had been living before she packed everything she owned into a trunk, sold the trunk because she could not carry it, repacked what mattered into a canvas bag, and climbed aboard a westbound train. The Covington Ranch was the largest operation in that part of Wyoming Territory, running cattle from spring to late fall and maintaining a crew of hired hands year-round. It was known for being a square outfit. David Covington, the owner, was known for paying fair wages and not cheating his workers, which was not a common reputation to have, and was therefore a striking one. He was also known, though this was said more quietly and with more speculation in the telling, for having been a widower for 3 years and for not having remarried, despite the fact that eligible women in the territory were few enough that a man of his means should have had no difficulty finding one. Maria was not thinking about any of that as she came up the road to the main gate. She was thinking about whether there was any work to be had. A man leaning on a fence post watched her approach. He was young, not yet 20, Maria guessed, with a sunburned neck and a startled expression that he was trying to arrange into something more dignified. He pushed off from the post and pulled his hat off as she reached the gate. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "You looking for someone?" "I am looking for work," Maria said. "Is Mr. Covington available?" The young man blinked. He looked at the hammer, he looked at the dress. He looked at her face, which was calm and direct and gave no apology for any of it. I'll go fetch him," he said, and retreated in a hurry toward the barn. Maria stood at the gate and waited. The ranch spread out around her in the early morning light, and despite her tiredness and her hunger, she had eaten nothing since a hard biscuit the evening before. She felt a small, involuntary lifting of her spirits at the sight of it. The main house was a 2-story structure of rough-hewn timber, solid and square, with a long porch running its full width. Behind it rose the mountains, still carrying snow on their high ridges, pale and enormous against the blue sky. Cattle were visible in the distant pasture, dark shapes moving slowly through the new spring grass. A dog trotted across the yard, glanced at her with professional curiosity, and moved on about its business. It was a working place. Maria had always liked working places. She heard footsteps on the porch boards before she saw him, and when David Covington came around the corner of the house and down the porch steps, she understood immediately why people spoke of him with a particular quality in their voices. Not reverence exactly, but something adjacent to it. He was not a tall man, though he was not short either. He was lean in the way of a man who works hard every day of his life, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they knew what they were doing. He was perhaps 34 or 35, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that was weathered and serious but not unkind. He wore work clothes, canvas trousers, a collarless shirt, suspenders, and he was carrying a coffee cup, which suggested she had caught him at breakfast. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked at her. She looked back. There was a moment of that particular silence that happens when two people are assessing each other honestly, without pretense, and both of them know it. Says you're looking for work," David Covington said. His voice was level, unhurried, a Wyoming voice, the kind of voice that did not waste words. "Yes," Maria said. "I have experience with carpentry, general repair, livestock feeding and care, cooking, preserving, laundry and sewing. I can also keep accounts if that is of use. I'm asking for fair wages and a place to sleep. I do not require luxury. I do require honesty." He looked at the hammer again. "What's the hammer for?" he asked. "I carry it," she said, "because a woman traveling alone in this territory needs to be able to drive a nail or defend herself, and a hammer does both." Something shifted in his expression. It was not quite a smile, but it was something that lived in the same neighborhood. He turned his head toward the house. One of the hands, an older man, 50-ish, with a white mustache and the walk of someone whose knees had been giving him trouble for years, had appeared at the corner of the building, watching with poorly concealed interest. "Hank," David said, "go tell Mrs. Aldridge to put her in the good room." The older man's eyebrows went up approximately half an inch, which Maria would later learn represented, for Hank Brewer, the equivalent of falling over in astonishment. He recovered, nodded, and disappeared. Maria looked at David Covington. "That," she said carefully, "was not the response I was expecting." "What were you expecting?" "A question about whether I had a husband or a brother who would be along shortly to claim me." "Do you?" "No." "Then it doesn't matter," he said simply. "Come in and have breakfast. You look like you haven't eaten since yesterday." She almost denied it out of pride. But she was too hungry for pride, which was, she would think later, perhaps the most honest introduction to a man she had ever had. She followed him up the porch steps and through the front door of the house, and when the smell of coffee and fried salt pork reached her, she felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for months. The good room, it turned out, was a small but decent bedroom on the second floor of the house, with a window that looked east toward the mountains and a quilt on the bed that was faded but clean. There was a washstand with a porcelain basin, a 3-drawer chest, and a rag rug on the plank floor. Maria set her canvas bag down on the chest and stood for a moment looking at the room, and then she went downstairs to have breakfast and discuss terms. The housekeeper, Mrs. Aldridge, was a stout, capable woman of 60 or so who had been running the domestic side of the Covington ranch for the past decade. She had the air of someone who has seen everything and been surprised by very little, and she received Maria's presence at the breakfast table with equanimity and 2 thick slices of bread and a fried egg. Over the course of that first meal, with David Covington at the head of the table drinking his second cup of coffee, and 3 ranch hands eating at the far end with the focused efficiency of working men, Maria laid out her qualifications honestly, and David listened and asked practical questions. What she did not do was explain what had brought her to Wyoming territory, and he did not ask. That restraint, she would think later, was the first thing she truly respected about him. The terms they settled on were fair $7 a month plus room and board, with the understanding that her primary responsibilities would be helping Mrs. Aldridge with the house and preserving, taking on whatever repair and carpentry work arose, and assisting with the ranch accounts, which were currently a situation that David described as not ideal, with an expression that suggested this was a significant understatement. Maria took one look at the ledger books that afternoon and understood that not ideal meant that 3 years of a working ranch's finances had been recorded by a series of different hands, in different systems, with occasional gaps that represented months when apparently no one had been recording anything at all. It was not fraud. It was simply chaos. She sat down at the roll-top desk in the small office off the main room and began to make sense of it. And 4 hours later she surfaced with a headache and a list of questions. And she found David Covington on the porch doing the calculations for spring cattle purchases. "You are short," she said, sitting down in the chair beside the porch railing. "Approximately $43 from last October's feed purchase, and someone made a billing error on the sale to Hendricks Cattle that reversed the decimal on a $150 payment. You have also been paying for fence posts that, based on the inventory, were never delivered." He set down his pencil and looked at her. "How long did it take you to find all that?" he asked. 4 hours, she said. "Though I have not finished." He was quiet for a moment. The wind came down off the mountains and moved through the yard, lifting a drift of dust along the fence line. "Where did you learn accounts?" he asked. "My father kept a dry goods store in Independence, Missouri," she said. "I kept his books from the time I was 12 years old until he died." "When did he die?" 4 years ago. He did not ask what had happened in the 4 years between. Again, she was grateful for that. "All right," he said. "Add accounts to your duties. I'll adjust the pay to $8. $8.50, she said. There was the briefest pause, then, "Done." She went back inside. The first week at the Covington Ranch passed in a kind of absorbed industry that Maria had not felt in a long time. The accounts consumed her mornings. The carpentry consumed her afternoons. There was a section of the barn where the second-story loft planking had rotted through in 2 places, and 3 fence gates along the south pasture that were held together with prayers and baling wire. She repaired all of it methodically, with the hammer she had carried 4 miles up a dusty road, and the ranch hands watched her work with an expression that traveled from skepticism to surprised respect in the space of about 2 days. The oldest of them, Hank Brewer, was the one who first spoke to her with something resembling warmth rather than cautious courtesy. He found her on the 3rd afternoon fitting new planking into the barn loft, and he stood below watching for a while before he said, "You nail that much cleaner than the last fellow we had." "Thank you," she said, driving the last nail home. "Where'd you learn carpentry?" "The same place I learned everything else," she said. "Necessity," he nodded. "That's generally the best teacher." She climbed down the ladder and found him looking at her with an expression of genuine curiosity rather than calculation, which she had learned to distinguish from the other kind. "What brought you out here?" he asked. "If you don't mind saying." "I was looking for a place where the work was honest and the pay was honest," she said. "That's what everybody says," he replied, "but it's generally not the whole story." She smiled at that because it was true. "No," she agreed, "it is generally not the whole story." He did not push further. She liked him for that too. The whole story, which she was not yet ready to tell anyone, was this. Maria Garrison had been engaged to be married in Independence, Missouri, to a man named Carl Whitmore, who was charming and well-dressed and turned out, upon closer examination, to be neither honest nor decent. He had borrowed money from her money she had saved from years of keeping her father's accounts, and then, after her father's death, from taking in washing and sewing, under the pretense of investing it in a business venture that would benefit them both when they married. The business venture did not exist. Carl Whitmore, she had discovered 3 months before their planned wedding date, had used her money to fund a different life in Kansas City, one that included another woman and a set of debts he was in the process of evading. He had not exactly stolen from her, or rather, he had stolen from her in a way that was perfectly legal, because she had given him the money freely, because she had trusted him, and the law in 1878 had very little interest in the complaints of women who had been deceived by the men they were engaged to marry. She had taken what was left of her savings, which was very little, and she had left Missouri. She had not told anyone at the Covington Ranch this story because it was hers, and because she was not sure yet whether she wanted to be seen as someone it had happened to. It was in the 2nd week that she began to understand David Covington's story, or at least the outline of it. She learned it mostly from Mrs. Aldridge, who was not a gossip but was a pragmatist, and who seemed to have decided early that Maria was someone who could be trusted with information, and who needed to understand the household she was now part of in order to function effectively within it. Over the course of a morning spent putting up the first preserved goods of the spring season, the wild ramps that grew along the creek, and some dried apple that had been kept over from fall, Mrs. Aldridge told Maria about Eleanor Covington. Eleanor had come to Wyoming territory as a young woman, had married David when they were both 23, and had built a life at the ranch with him through 7 years of hard winters and dry summers, and the particular difficulties of ranching on the frontier. She had been, by all accounts, a strong-willed and capable woman who had loved this land with the same fierce possessiveness as her husband. She had died of influenza in the winter of 1875, along with their infant daughter who had been only 6 weeks old. "He doesn't speak of it," Mrs. Aldridge said, working a knife through a bunch of ramps with the efficiency of long practice. "Not to the hands, not to the neighbors. He works. He runs the ranch. He's fair and he's capable and he's kind in his way, but he's been closed up like a book on a shelf for 3 years. Anyone can see it." Maria was quiet for a moment, processing this. "I see," she said. "I'm not telling you to feel sorry for him," Mrs. Aldridge said briskly. "He'd hate that. I'm telling you so you understand why he sometimes looks like he's somewhere else even when he's standing right in front of you." Maria nodded. She thought about that conversation for the rest of the day. She thought about it while she was finishing the fence gates, driving nails into the new timber with steady, unhurried strokes. She thought about a man carrying 3 years of grief like a stone in his chest, and about a woman who had left everything she knew to start over somewhere honest, and about how sometimes the things we carry are heavier than what shows on the outside. She was not thinking about love. She was not thinking about David Covington in any particular way. She was thinking about grief, and about how it felt to lose things, and about how the territory they were standing on, this raw, wind-scoured, gorgeous stretch of Wyoming, did not care about any of it and somehow made it easier to bear. The afternoon of the 15th day, there was a problem with the horses. 2 of the ranch's working horses, a big gray named Soldier and a sorrel mare called Penny, had gotten into the section of pasture where last year's wild onion grew thick, and had eaten enough of it to make themselves genuinely sick. The hands were out on the spring cattle drive, which had begun 2 days earlier and left the ranch with a skeleton crew. Hank was in town for supplies. Mrs. Aldridge was a domestic creature who freely admitted she knew nothing about horses beyond which end bit. David had been up since before dawn and had ridden 20 miles that morning and looked, when he came back, to find the horses sick, like a man who had already used up his reserves. Maria had read about wild onion poisoning in horses. She had never treated it, but she had read about it, because reading was what she did instead of sleeping on the nights when the thoughts would not leave her alone, and she had gotten into the habit years ago of reading whatever was useful. She found the raw linseed oil in the tack room. She had noted it there on her first day, categorizing the contents of every building on the ranch out of pure organizational habit, and she had the horses dosed and moved to clean pasture before David had finished unsaddling his own horse. She was washing her hands at the pump when he came out of the barn and found both sick horses standing quietly in the small paddock by the house, looking not exactly well but notably more settled than they had been. He stopped and looked at them. He looked at her. "You know horses," he said. "I know what I've read about horses," she said, "and I know where everything on this ranch is stored, which helps. You've cataloged the inventory." In my head, yes, it seemed useful. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was not the appraising look of an employer examining an employee's work. It was something more direct than that, and she felt it land somewhere below her sternum. "Maria," he said, which was the first time he had used her Christian name. "Why are you here?" She could have told him then. Part of her wanted to, but she was not yet ready, and more importantly, she was not sure what answer he was actually asking for. "The pay is fair," she said. He looked at her for another moment, and then something that was definitely a smile crossed his face, brief and real, like sunlight on water. "That's not what I mean," he said. "I know," she said, "but it will have to do for now." He accepted that. Later that evening, he appeared in the doorway of the office while she was finishing the month's accounts, and he was carrying 2 cups of coffee, and he sat in the chair across from the desk without asking permission, which she found she did not mind at all. "The horses will be fine," she said, not looking up from the ledger. "I know, thank you. You don't need to thank me, it's part of the work." "No, it isn't," he said. "I didn't hire you for the horses. That was above and beyond." She looked up at him. He was watching her with that direct quality she had noticed on the first day and had not quite gotten used to, the way he looked at things, at situations, at problems, at people, without flinching from what was there. "Where are you from?" he asked. "Missouri," she said. "What part?" "Independence." He nodded slowly. "Long way to come." "Yes." "Did you have people there, family?" "My mother died when I was 8. My father died 4 years ago. I have a younger sister who married well and does not require my presence." That last line came out with slightly more edge than she intended, and she saw him register it, file it away without comment. "And yet you left," he said. "And yet I left." The fire in the small iron stove crackled. Outside, the April wind was picking up, moving across the yard with a sound like rushing water. Somewhere in the pasture, one of the cattle lowed softly. "I left once," David said. "Before I came here, I grew up in Virginia, didn't see a future in Virginia, came west when I was 20, took work wherever I could find it, saved, bought this land when it was nothing, built it into what it is now." "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "Virginia." He thought about that genuinely, which she liked. He did not give her the easy answer. "I miss what it was before the war," he said. "I don't miss what it became after." She understood that. She did not press. They sat in a companionable silence for a few minutes, drinking their coffee, and Maria was aware of something settling between them, not romantic yet, not anything she was prepared to name, but something real. A mutual recognition. The sense of 2 people who have both been through things and come out still standing, meeting each other in a place that requires honesty. "The accounts," she said, because she needed to say something practical before she thought too hard about the rest of it, "are now in order. I've identified 3 active discrepancies that need to be addressed before the end of the month." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it changed his face completely. The serious, weathered lines of it opened up into something younger and warmer. "Of course you have," he said, and then quieter, "Thank you, Maria, for all of it." She looked at the fire. "You're welcome, David," she said. Spring deepened into late May, and the days grew long and golden, and Maria Garrison became as much a part of the Covington ranch as the fence posts she repaired and the ledgers she kept. The ranch hands, after their initial wariness, had come to regard her with the particular respect that practical people extend to other practical people who demonstrate, consistently and without fuss, that they know what they are doing. Hank Brewer, who was the oldest and whose opinion carried the most weight, had stopped treating her with cautious courtesy and started treating her like a colleague, which was a more meaningful upgrade than it might sound. The work was good. The work was, in fact, the best work Maria had done since she was a young woman helping her father with the accounts, and felt, for the first time, the satisfaction of being genuinely useful. She had not realized until she came to the Covington ranch how starved she had been for that feeling. She had spent the years after her father's death, and before Carl Whitmore's revelation, trying to make herself fit into a smaller life than she needed, trying to be adequate to someone else's idea of who she should be, and it had worn her down in ways she had not fully understood until she was no longer doing it. Out here, she was exactly what she was, and what she was turned out to be needed. She was repairing a section of the kitchen garden fence one afternoon. In late May, the deer had gotten in twice that week and ruined a third of the early lettuce, when David came out of the house and sat on the porch steps to watch her work. He did this sometimes, she had noticed. He did not hover. He was not in the habit of supervising. But he came and sat when she was working outdoors, and he brought coffee sometimes, or he simply sat and they talked or did not talk and both were equally comfortable. "I need to go to Cheyenne next week," he said. "There's a cattle buyer I need to meet with in the bank. I'll be gone 4 or 5 days." "All right," she said, driving a nail cleanly into the new post. "I'd like you to manage the house accounts while I'm gone, pay the weekly wages, manage the provisions. Hank will handle the ranch operations." She looked at him. "You're trusting me with the wage payments." "I've trusted you with the accounts for 2 months," he said. "This is the same thing. Some people would see it as different. Some people would be wrong," he said simply. She drove the last nail. There was a pause, the comfortable kind. "I'll need the authorization written out," she said, "for the hands. Some of them might question instructions from me." "I'll write it out tonight," he said. And then, unexpectedly, "Though I'd wager most of them wouldn't question you." "Tom Sayers would," she said, because it was accurate. Tom Sayers was the youngest of the permanent hands and the only one who had consistently treated Maria's presence at the ranch as something between an inconvenience and an affront, in the particular way of a young man who has never had to work alongside a competent woman and has no framework for it. David said nothing for a moment. "Then Tom Sayers will do what he's told. He'll do it better if he doesn't feel challenged," she said. "Let me handle Tom. Can you?" "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "I believe you," he said. And he did, which was the thing that kept surprising her. Not the sentiment but the reality of it. The way his trust was not cautious or conditional or accompanied by a list of exceptions. He extended it straightforwardly as a fact, and she found that she treasured it more than she expected to. He left for Cheyenne on a Monday. The 4 days he was gone were busy and unremarkable and passed without difficulty. Maria paid the wages, managed the provisions, mediated a dispute between 2 of the seasonal hands about a missing bridle that turned out to be hanging in plain sight in the wrong stall, and got Tom Sayers to repair the water trough without making it feel like a conflict, which she accomplished by asking his advice about the best wood for the job, and then expressing genuine appreciation when his recommendation turned out to be correct. She also spent a good deal of the 4 days noticing, with a clarity that surprised her, that she missed David Covington, not in a way she was prepared to examine. Just in the daily texture of things, his presence on the porch in the evenings, his footsteps on the stairs in the morning, the conversations that were about the ranch and the work, and also, underneath it, about something else that neither of them had named yet. She was sitting on the porch on the evening of the 4th day, doing the week's accounts by the last light, when she heard hoofbeats on the road and looked up to see him coming through the gate on his bay horse, dusty and tired and back from Cheyenne. She was surprised by the warmth that moved through her chest when she saw him. She was even more surprised by the fact that she let herself feel it, rather than immediately constructing a practical reason why it was something else. He rode up to the porch and dismounted, and she saw the moment he noticed her sitting there, the way something in his posture eased, almost imperceptibly, like a door swinging open on quiet hinges. "Everything in order?" he asked. "Everything in order," she said. "Wages paid, trough repaired, supply inventory updated, and I found another billing discrepancy from the Hendricks account, a different one, from February." He tied his horse at the rail and came up the steps, and he stood in front of her with his hat in his hands, and she looked up at him from the chair, and the last light of the day fell gold and long across the porch boards. "How was Cheyenne?" she asked. "Loud," he said. "Too many people." "Did the cattle buyer deal fairly?" "Fairly enough." He paused. "I thought about the ranch the whole time I was gone." She waited, sensing there was more to that. "About the accounts," he said. "About the spring work." "About—" He stopped. "About what?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. In the fading light, his face was very still, and she could see the effort of a man who was not accustomed to saying the things he meant, trying to decide whether to say them. "About the fact that I'd like to come home to this porch every evening," he said, "and that for the past 4 days that thought didn't feel like thinking about the ranch." The wind moved through the yard. The last birds of the evening called from somewhere down by the creek. Maria looked at the accounts ledger in her lap. She set it aside carefully on the small table by the railing. "David," she said. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I'm not this isn't I don't want to make things difficult. Your position here doesn't depend on I know," she said. "That is not why I'm hesitating." He was still. "Then why?" he asked. She looked at the mountains dark against the last pale sky. "Because there are things you don't know about me," she said. "Things I should tell you before anything, and I'm not sure yet how to say them." "Then say them badly," he said. "Say them wrong. Say them however they come out. I'd rather hear an honest mess than a polished silence." She looked at him, startled. And then she told him about Carl Whitmore. All of it, the engagement, the trust, the money, the discovery, the departure. She did not spare herself in the telling. She was clear about what she had chosen and why and what it had cost her. She spoke plainly and without drama, and when she was finished there was a silence that lasted long enough for the first stars to appear above the mountain ridge. "He took your money," David said. "It was not a question. What the law would consider voluntarily given, yes. And he lied to you about what he was. For 2 years." He was quiet for another moment. Then, in a voice that was very controlled, "What is his current whereabouts?" "I have no idea," she said. "And I have made my peace with not knowing because knowing would not undo what happened." He looked at the mountains. "The reason I am telling you this," Maria said carefully, "is not to ask for your sympathy. I am telling you because you deserve to know if you are considering if this is." She paused and started again. "I am not a woman who has had an uncomplicated life, David. I have been deceived, and I have been poor, and I have had to learn everything the hard way. I am 30 years old and I have no family and very little in the way of worldly possessions. I carry a hammer because I have learned that I need to be able to take care of myself." She met his eyes. "I want you to know all of that before you say anything else." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm a 35-year-old widower whose wife and daughter are buried on this land," he said quietly. "I have spent 3 years not knowing how to begin again. I have run this ranch like a machine because it was the only way I knew to get through the days. I am not uncomplicated either." He paused. "I don't need uncomplicated. I need honest. And you are the most honest person I have met in a very long time." Maria Garrison, who had not cried in front of anyone since the day she left Independence, felt the back of her throat tighten. "I need to know that you mean that," she said. I will not make another mistake of that kind." "I know," he said. "And I won't ask you to trust me before I've earned it. That's fair, that's as it should be." He picked up his hat which he had set on the railing. "But I meant what I said," he added, "about the porch, about coming home." He went inside to wash up and eat, and Maria sat on the porch in the growing dark, looking at the mountains and the stars and the silver-lit yard, and she let herself feel, fully, and without trying to explain it away, what was growing in her chest, something careful and warm and terrifyingly real. June arrived in a blaze of wildflowers along the creek banks, and Maria Garrison and David Covington began a courtship that neither of them described as such, but that was unmistakably that, conducted in the way of two cautious and self-sufficient people. Through long evening conversations on the porch, through shared work in the early mornings, through the 100 small moments in the daily life of the ranch, where they moved alongside each other with an easy, unself-conscious attunement that was, in its way, more intimate than anything more formal could have been. He showed her the graves one afternoon in early June, Aliner's and the baby's, side by side under a cottonwood tree at the eastern edge of the property, where the ground rose slightly and you could see the full sweep of the ranch below. He stood beside the markers without speaking for a while, and Maria stood beside him without speaking either, because this was not a moment for words. When he finally spoke, he said, "Her name was Alice. The baby. She had Aliner's hair, what little she had." His voice was steady but only just. "I am sorry," Maria said. And she was not the formal, automatic sorry of social obligation, but the real kind, the kind that comes from having lost things yourself and understanding the particular weight of a specific absence. "I don't talk about it," he said. "Didn't think I could, still not sure I can do it well." "You don't have to do it well," she said. "You just did it." He looked at her. The afternoon light lay warm on his face, and the cottonwood moved overhead, and she saw in his expression something that had not been there on the first day she arrived at his gate, something opening, like land after a long drought. He reached over and took her hand. Just that quietly, simply, not asking for anything more than the fact of her hand in his. And she let him hold it, and they stood there for a while, under the cottonwood in the June afternoon, and everything between them settled into something both more serious and more gentle than it had been before. The summer brought its own rhythms, the long cattle drives, the haying, the maintenance of fences and buildings against the dry heat. Maria's days were full from early morning to evening, and she loved the fullness of them. She had taken over a section of the kitchen garden and extended it substantially, planting beans and squash and a stand of sunflowers along the south wall of the house. She had reorganized the root cellar, cataloged the tack room properly for the first time in what appeared to be years, and was in the process of repairing the secondary barn's east wall, which had developed a lean that was not yet dangerous but would become so over the next winter if left unaddressed. The hammer she had carried from the crossroads was in use every single day. Tom Sayers, who had begun the summer as the only genuine resistance to Maria's presence, underwent a gradual and somewhat touching transformation over the course of June. It began when she helped him, without being asked, to calculate the load weights for the hay wagon, which he had been doing by a method that was systematically underestimating capacity and costing the ranch trips. He had accepted her correction with ill grace, and then, over the following days, had silently begun using her method. He had not apologized or acknowledged the shift, but he had nodded at her the following Monday with the specific quality of a young man who has decided, privately, to stop being wrong. By July, he was asking her questions directly, and she answered them without making anything of the fact that he was asking. And by August, he had become one of her more reliable allies on the ranch in the practical, undemonstrative way of a young man who respects competence when he finally sees it clearly. It was in July that the situation with the neighbor to the south, a man named Gerald Pierce, came to a head. Pierce ran a smaller cattle operation and had a long-standing disagreement with David about the boundary between their properties, specifically about the water rights to a section of the creek that ran along the shared fence line. Pierce had been, in the years Maria had been on the ranch, a background source of low-level friction. His cattle occasionally crossed the boundary, his hands occasionally left gates open, and there was a persistent complaint about the fence line itself that had been simmering for 2 years. What escalated it in July was a conversation Maria overheard by accident. Pierce stopping by the ranch while David was out, speaking to Hank with a quality of barely controlled aggression about the fence line, and making, in the course of that conversation, a reference to whatever woman Covington's got keeping his books now, in a tone that made Hank's jaw set visibly. Maria, who was in the adjacent room working on the accounts, recognized the tone of a man who has decided that the way to pressure someone is through the people around them. She made a note of the details of the boundary dispute and the specific legal claims Pierce had been making, and that evening she laid it out for David at the dinner table, not as a problem but as an analysis, with the relevant land grant documents from the ranch files that she had located and cross-referenced. David looked at the documents for a long time. "This is the original survey," he said. "Yes, filed in the county recorder's office in 1872. I wrote for a copy 2 months ago when I was sorting the land documents. I had a feeling it might be relevant." He looked up from the papers at her. "You wrote for this 2 months ago." "It seemed prudent," she said. "The water rights question came up in the February accounts. There was a correspondence file with Pierce from that time. The original survey resolves the question clearly." He leaned back in his chair. "Maria," he said, in a tone that was part exasperation and part something she was beginning to recognize as a kind of helpless affection. "Is there anything you don't think 5 steps ahead on?" "Most emotional situations," she said honestly. He smiled at that. Hank, who was eating at the other end of the table and had been pretending for the past 10 minutes not to be listening, made a sound that might have been a cough. The land dispute with Pierce was resolved in mid-July, when David presented the original survey documents to Pierce and the county land agent simultaneously, in a meeting at the agent's office in town that Maria had arranged, and at which she was present as the person who could explain the documented chain of title most clearly. Pierce was not happy. He was also clearly outwitted, and the land agent ruled in David's favor on the water rights question without ambiguity. On the ride back to the ranch afterward, David and Maria rode side by side on the wagon road in the late afternoon heat, and the land around them was golden and enormous, and after a while David said without preamble, "I want to ask you something." "All right," she said. "Not about the ranch." "All right," she said again, and the word came out a little less even than the first time. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the road ahead. "I know I said I would earn your trust before I asked for anything," he said, "and I mean to keep to that, but I want to know, are you content here, at the ranch, in the life as it is?" She thought about it honestly, as he deserved. "I am," she said. "More than I have been in years, perhaps more than I have ever been. Even with," he seemed to search for words, "even knowing that there is a grief in this place that I am still learning to carry differently. Even with that," she said, "grief is not something that disqualifies a place or a person, David. If it were, there would be no one left standing." He turned to look at her, and the afternoon light was in his eyes, and she saw in his face plainly what she had been watching grow there over the past months, something deep and sure, the kind of feeling that does not arrive quickly and does not leave easily. "I love you," he said. The plainness of it was startling. He said it the way he said everything, without theater, without preliminary, as a simple and irrevocable fact. "I have been trying to find the right moment and the right words for 2 months, and I don't think there are right words. That is the true thing. I love you." Maria Garrison sat very still on the wagon seat, with the Wyoming wind moving her hair and the mountains standing white and enormous to the west, and she felt the warmth in her chest that had been building since the night he came home from Cheyenne expand into something that filled her entirely. "I love you too," she said. "I have for some time. I was not certain how to say it." "Badly," he said, and the smile broke through. "Say it badly, remember," she laughed. The laugh surprised her, full and real, a laugh she had not heard herself give in a long time. "I love you," she said again. "There, badly or otherwise." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had at Aliner's grave, and he held it for the rest of the drive home, and neither of them needed to say anything more for a long time. The August evening they sat on the porch together after supper, with the first hint of coming autumn in the cooler nights. David asked her to marry him. He did not make a production of it. He had a ring, a simple gold band that had been his grandmother's, which he had retrieved from the box in his top bureau drawer where it had been sitting since Aliner's wedding ring had gone onto Aliner's hand and stayed there. He held it out and he said, "Maria, will you marry me? Not because it is practical and not because the ranch needs you, because I want to build the rest of my life with you." She looked at the ring, and she looked at his face, and she thought about the woman she had been when she walked up this road in her best dress and her cracked boots with a hammer in her hand, and she thought about the woman she was now, the same woman, but fuller somehow, more entirely herself than she had been in years. "Yes," she said. "With my whole heart, yes." He put the ring on her finger and it fit perfectly, which seemed like a good sign for everything. They were married in October of 1878, on a Saturday, at the small white church in town that was used interchangeably by Presbyterians and Methodists depending on the week, and had a minister named Reverend Thorne who was practical-minded, and performed the ceremony with a pleasant brevity that both the bride and groom appreciated. Mrs. Aldridge had made a cake and had also, mysteriously, produced a dress, not Maria's blue working dress, but a proper cream-colored wool gown with a lace collar that she had quietly constructed over the preceding 3 weeks from a bolt of fabric she had ordered from Cheyenne without telling anyone. Maria had stood in front of the small mirror in the good room, which was still her room, though that would change after the ceremony, and looked at herself in the dress, and Mrs. Aldridge had been standing behind her with the expression of a woman who is very satisfied with a job well done. "You didn't have to do this," Maria said. "No," Mrs. Aldridge agreed, "but it needed doing." The ceremony was attended by Hank and Tom and the other permanent hands, by the families of several neighboring ranchers who had come to know Maria over the summer, and by a handful of townspeople who had been curious about the woman at the Covington ranch who kept the books and repaired the barns and rode like she had been born on horseback. Maria walked down the aisle of the small church toward David, who was standing at the front in his best dark coat with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that made every woman in the building catch her breath just slightly, and she thought, "I carried a hammer to your gate, and you put me in the good room, and here we are." She reached him and he took her hand and he looked at her with that direct, honest look, the one that had never flinched from what was actually there, and she looked back, and Reverend Thorne began to speak, and the October light came through the small windows in long golden shafts, and Maria Garrison became Maria Covington in a church full of people who had watched something real happen and were glad of it. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was hard, the way Wyoming winters were hard, relentless cold, heavy snow, weeks where the ranch was effectively isolated, and the work of keeping the animals alive and the pipes from freezing was exhausting and constant. Maria and David worked side by side through all of it, and she discovered that a marriage, like a ranch, revealed itself most truly in the difficult parts. What she discovered about David Covington in the difficulty was this: he was patient. He was not always easy. He had a stubbornness that came from years of making every decision alone, and he had silences that could last for days when something was troubling him, and he struggled with asking for help in a way that had clearly been habitual for a long time. But he was patient. He was fair. When they disagreed, and they did disagree, because both of them were strong-minded people who had formed their own views through experience and did not abandon them easily, he argued his position and listened to hers and was willing, genuinely willing, to be wrong. That last quality she had not expected and treasured beyond most things. What he discovered about her, she gathered from the conversations they had in the long winter evenings by the fire, was that she was more tender than she appeared. That beneath the capability and the practicality and the unsentimental directness was a woman with a fierce emotional life that she had learned, out of necessity, to keep largely private. He learned to read the signs of it, the particular quality of her attention when something moved her, the way her hands stilled when she was feeling something she did not have words for, and he treated what he learned gently, which was all she had ever asked of anyone and rarely received. By the time the snow began to melt in March of 1879, something had been built between them that was deeper and more complex and more entirely itself than what had been there in October. Not less romantic, if anything more so in the way of things that have been tested and held, but richer, more layered. Maria was pregnant by April. She told David in the kitchen on an early April morning, standing at the stove making coffee, because it seemed right that such news should happen in the middle of ordinary life rather than being staged. She simply turned from the stove and said, "I believe we are going to have a child." He was very still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her, carefully and completely, with his face bent to her hair, and she felt him shaking very slightly, which she understood was the feeling of a man who had lost a child and was now being offered the terrifying, extraordinary possibility of another. "Are you well?" he asked into her hair. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Tired, a little queasy in the mornings, but well." He held her for a long moment more. "Maria," he said. "I know," she said, because she did. She knew the particular weight of what this meant for him, the grief and the hope impossibly intertwined, the love and the fear walking hand in hand. She knew, and she held him back. The summer of 1879 was a good one. The cattle prices were favorable. The haying went smoothly. The water held through the dry weeks of August. And Maria continued to work through the pregnancy with the same matter-of-fact practicality she brought to everything, adjusting what needed to be adjusted and refusing to adjust what did not. She climbed fewer ladders. She delegated more of the heavy carpentry to Tom Sayers, who had grown into a capable young man, and had recently started asking Hank's permission to ride into town on Saturday evenings, which Hank granted with the air of someone performing a civic duty. Mrs. Aldridge, who had seen a good many things in her 60 years, had also apparently seen a good many pregnancies, and she took on the role of guardian and advisor with the quiet authority of someone who knows exactly what she is doing. The ranch, which had always run efficiently, ran now with an additional attentiveness to the well-being of its mistress that was both touching and, to Maria, occasionally exasperating. "You are all treating me as though I am made of glass," she said one afternoon in September to David, who had carried in the accounts ledger from the office on the grounds that she should not have to walk 20 extra feet. "We are treating you with care," he said, with the expression of a man who knows he is being slightly ridiculous and is not prepared to stop. "I am capable of carrying a ledger," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I also know you carried a hammer 4 miles up a dirt road. I am not questioning your capability. He set the ledger down on the table. "I am nervous. I am allowed to be nervous." She looked at him. His face was open in that way it had become over the past year, the guardedness worn away, not gone entirely. It was part of who he was, but modulated now, softened by the fact of being truly known. "You are allowed to be nervous," she agreed. "You are not allowed to carry my ledgers on that basis." "Compromise," he said. "I carry the ledger, you carry the coffee." She thought about it. "Done." He smiled, and it was the full smile now, the one that reached his eyes and changed the whole character of his face, the one she had fallen in love with on a porch in Wyoming in the summer of 1878. Their son was born in November of 1879, in the middle of a snowstorm that had begun 2 days earlier and showed no signs of relenting. He arrived with what the midwife, a capable woman from town named Mrs. Pierce, described as gratifying efficiency, and he was healthy and loud and had, when they cleaned him up and put him in Maria's arms, a remarkable quantity of dark hair and a disgruntled expression that David, looking over Maria's shoulder, said was the exact expression she wore when she discovered an accounting discrepancy. Maria laughed, which was perhaps not the most conventional first response to meeting one's child, but which seemed to her exactly right. "What shall we call him?" David asked. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his hand resting on Maria's, the baby between them, and the storm outside made the world a small and contained thing, just this room and this warmth and this new person. "James," Maria said, which was her father's name. She had thought about it for months and come back to it always. "James Covington," David said. He tried the sound of it in his mouth. "That's a good name." "James Arthur Covington," she said. "Arthur was your father's name, wasn't it?" He looked at her. "You remembered that. You mentioned it once," she said. "Last winter you were talking about Virginia." He looked at the baby, at James Arthur Covington, 8 pounds and angry at the world, who had arrived in a snowstorm and would grow up on this land and under these mountains and would, his parents hoped and intended, know himself to be wholly and completely loved. "James Arthur," David said softly. "Yes, that's right." The winter passed, and spring came again, and the ranch went on with its seasons, cattle and haying and preserving and accounts, and the endless work of maintaining a living enterprise on the frontier. James grew from a newborn who slept in the cradle David had built during Maria's pregnancy into a small person with strong opinions, and an enthusiasm for being outdoors that had the entire ranch staff taking turns keeping track of him by the time he was walking steadily. It was in the spring of 1881 that Maria, sitting at the roll-top desk in the office on a warm afternoon with the window open and James asleep upstairs, and the sounds of the ranch coming in on the April breeze, finished balancing the accounts for the first quarter and sat back in her chair and understood, with a sudden, full, uncomplicated clarity, that she was happy, not performing happiness, not managing a version of life that was acceptable, not surviving or enduring or making the best of things. Happy, the deep-rooted kind that does not depend on the absence of difficulty but on the presence of something true. She heard David's boots on the porch steps, and then his voice talking to Tom about the south pasture fence, and then his footsteps in the hallway and the office door opened. "Accounts done?" he asked, leaning in the doorframe. "First quarter balanced," she said. "We're in better shape than last year at this time. The Hendricks purchase is fully cleared, and I've set aside the reserve for the summer hands." "Good." He came into the office and stood by the window looking out at the yard. He had been out since early morning and he was dusty and tired in the honest way of a man who has done a good day's work, and she looked at him with the particular pleasure of looking at someone you know deeply and find still simply beautiful. "James is asleep," she said. "I'll check on him in a bit." He turned from the window. "Maria, come for a ride with me this evening, before supper. The wildflowers are out on the eastern ridge." "I have to finish the Maria," he said, and there was that smile, the quiet one, the full one. She closed the ledger. "All right," she said. They rode out in the late afternoon, just the two of them, up the slope to the eastern ridge, where the spring wildflowers were indeed out in a sweep of color: yellow balsam root and purple lupin. And the small white things she had learned were called bitterroot, though they did not taste bitter, David had told her once, only intense. They sat their horses on the ridge and looked out over the ranch below, the buildings, the pastures, the silver thread of the creek, the cattle moving in the lower field, the enormous sky above everything. "I want to tell you something," David said. "Then tell me." "I used to stand here," he said, "after Alina died. I used to ride up here because I couldn't stand being in the house and I couldn't stand looking at the land from down there, because every piece of it felt like something I was supposed to be sharing with someone and wasn't." He paused. "I haven't told you that before." "No," she said. "I stand here now," he said, "and it is entirely different. The land is the same. The mountains are the same, but it is entirely different because I am looking at it with you." Maria looked at the mountains. They were white still on their high faces, gleaming in the late-day sun, enormous and indifferent and breathtaking. "I came to your gate with a hammer," she said, "because it was all I had." "You had more than that," he said. "I did not know it then." "I know." He reached over as he always did and took her hand. "I'm glad you came anyway." She held his hand and they sat on the ridge in the late Wyoming afternoon, and below them the Covington ranch went on about its business with the steady, purposeful activity of a living thing. Tom Sayers mending fence in the south pasture, Hank checking on the horses in the small paddock, Mrs. Aldridge's figure moving through the kitchen garden, and Maria thought about a woman in a blue dress walking 4 miles up a dirt road with her best hopes and her only hammer, and arriving at a gate where a serious, weathered, honest man had looked at her and made a decision that was, in the way of all the best decisions, utterly straightforward. Put her in the good room. She had spent years looking for a place where she was needed. What she had found, instead, was something she had not known to look for, a place where she belonged. The years that followed were full ones. James turned 2 and then 3, and developed a passion for the horses that alarmed his mother initially and charmed his father completely. And by the time he was 4, he was being set on the back of the most placid of the ranch horses with David holding the lead rope, which James regarded as an insult to his dignity, and said so. He had Maria's directness and David's stubbornness and a laugh that belonged entirely to itself, and he was, without question or qualification, the most interesting person any of them had ever met. In the spring of 1883, when James was 3.5, Maria told David there would be a second child. This time she was more practiced in the telling and he was more practiced in the receiving, and while he still held her in the kitchen for longer than strictly necessary, the shaking was less and the joy was more immediate. A wide, open joy, uncomplicated by the first time's fear, because they had done this before and they knew now that it was something they could hold. The second child was a girl, born in September of 1883 on a warm evening, when the last light was golden through the bedroom windows, and the smell of cut hay came in from the fields. She arrived more deliberately than James had, taking her time about it in a way that the midwife said suggested she had opinions, which proved prescient. She was smaller than her brother had been, with eyes that were, in those first days, a color that could not quite decide whether it was green or brown, and she had David's mouth in Maria's hands and a quality of watchful attentiveness that made her seem, from the beginning, like someone who was paying careful attention to the world and had not yet decided what she thought of it. "Clara," Maria said, when they had her clean and wrapped in quiet. "Clara," David agreed. He said it the same way he had said James Arthur, trying it in his mouth, turning it over. "After my mother," Maria said. "Her name was Clara." He was quiet a moment. "She'd be pleased," he said. "She would have liked you," Maria said. "She had no patience for dishonest people. She would have liked you very much." "High praise," he said, and his voice was warm with it. Clara Covington, who had entered the world on a September evening with opinions and an appraising look, grew into a child of fierce intelligence and physical daring that kept her parents in a constant state of admiring alarm. By the time she was 2, she was following her brother everywhere. By the time she was 3, she was frequently leading, and James, who was 6 and should theoretically have been the one setting the direction, generally went along with whatever Clara had decided, which was a dynamic that Hank Brewer observed with great satisfaction and described as the natural order of things, probably. The ranch prospered. The years between 1879 and 1885 were, on the whole, good years for cattle ranching in Wyoming territory, and David Covington's operation, well run and honestly managed and financially sound, largely because of the meticulous attention to accounts and inventory that had been a feature of the ranch since a certain woman arrived with a hammer, grew in both size and reputation. The territory was changing around them, and not always in ways that were comfortable. The late 1870s and early 1880s brought more settlers, more fences, more disputes over land and water, and the larger political forces at work in the territory. The cattle barons who were beginning to consolidate power, the tensions between large and small operators, the distant but coming conflicts that would eventually erupt into something much larger, were part of the landscape of their daily conversations. Maria had strong views about the direction things were heading. She had seen, in Independence and in Cheyenne, and in the documents she read and the newspapers that arrived at the ranch, the way power consolidated itself and what it did to ordinary people in the process. She said what she thought about it, clearly and specifically, and David listened and pushed back and argued and came back to a position that was, ultimately, not far from hers. He was not a man who believed in pretending that the world was simple. He had seen what it did to people who pretended that. There was a conversation they had one evening in the fall of 1884, when James was 4.5 and Clara was just past 1, that Maria remembered for years afterward as one of the most important of their marriage. They were talking about a neighboring family, the Ryersons, who had a small homestead to the north, who were being pressured by a larger cattle operation to sell at an unfair price. The pressure was not violent, not yet, but it had the quality of pressure that had a direction. "We should help them," Maria said. "What can we do?" David asked. "We can make it clear that we are their neighbors and that this ranch stands behind their right to stay," she said. In practical terms, that means speaking to the men behind the pressure and making sure they understand that fair dealing in this area will be expected. We have more standing to say that than the Ryersons do alone. That may make us a target, he said. It may, she said. I grew up in a world where people didn't say that when someone was being treated unfairly, and I watched what happened. I would rather be a target for doing the right thing than safe for having said nothing. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. He went to speak to the men behind the pressure on the Ryersons the following week. He did not go with threats or with drama. He went with the survey documents and the water rights records and the financial history of the region and the particular quality of absolute plain-spoken certainty that was David Covington at his most effective. And he made it clear, in terms that could not be misunderstood, that the Ryersons had a neighbor who was paying attention. The pressure eased. The Ryersons stayed. Maria did not say anything when David told her, but she reached over and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they sat at the kitchen table in the warm lamplight with the sounds of the sleeping ranch around them, and the mountains outside invisible in the dark. It was in the summer of 1885 that something happened which tested them in a different way. Hank Brewer, who had been the longest-serving hand on the ranch, and who had been, in many ways, its institutional memory and moral backbone, had a fall from his horse in June that broke his leg badly. The break did not heal cleanly, as breaks sometimes did not in men of his age, and in that time and place where the options for medical care were limited. By September it was clear that Hank would not be returning to ranch work, and by the end of October he had moved to his daughter's house in Cheyenne. The leave-taking was not dramatic. Hank was not a dramatic man. He shook David's hand on the porch on the day he left and said, "You run a square outfit, Covington. Always have." He turned to Maria and said, "You're the best thing that walked through that gate, and I've been saying so since the first week." And then he climbed into the wagon and drove to town, and Maria stood on the porch and watched him go and felt the specific grief of losing someone who had been, without anyone making a formal declaration of it, a genuine friend. Tom Sayers took over as foreman, which was an event that would have been unimaginable 4 years earlier. Tom Sayers, who had been a suspicious boy when Maria arrived, had grown into a capable, fair-minded young man of 23, with a talent for managing people that he had developed partly by watching the way the ranch was run, and partly, Maria suspected, by the unconscious absorption of the values that permeated the place. He came to Maria the evening before his first official day as foreman, which was a thing she did not think he had planned. She could see by his expression that he had found himself at her office door before quite intending to be there. "Mrs. Covington," he said. "Tom," she said, "I just wanted to say," he stopped, tried again. "When I started here I wasn't easy about things, about you being here and managing things. I was stupid about it." "You were young about it," she said. "I'd like to think I'm less young now." "You are," she said, "considerably, and you will be an excellent foreman." He nodded, not quite sure what to do with the directness of the compliment, and then he went, and Maria went back to her accounts, and she felt something that was very close to pride. In the spring of 1886, Maria told David there would be a third child. He received this news on the porch in the morning with coffee in his hand, and his face went through a sequence of expressions: surprise, joy, something tender and private, before settling on the smile. "Are you pleased?" she asked. "I am," he said, bewilderingly, entirely pleased. He paused. "Are you?" She thought about it the way she always thought about important things, fully, without hurrying. "Yes," she said. "I am 48 years old. No, I'm 38 years old. And I have a good man and 2 wild children and a hammer that I have used every day for 8 years. And yes, I am very pleased." He set down his coffee cup and kissed her, there on the morning porch in the spring air with the mountains rising behind the house. And James, who had appeared at the screen door with a piece of bread in his hand, and the expression of a 6-year-old who is aware that something is happening and is not sure if he is supposed to witness it, retreated back inside and could be heard telling Clara, in a loud and explanatory whisper, that their parents were being strange again. The third child, a son, born in November of 1886, they named William, after no one in particular, and because it was a strong, simple name that suited him. And he was from the first day a peaceful child, round-faced and equable, who arrived in the world without drama and regarded it, apparently, as a reasonable place. He slept readily and woke cheerfully, and was regarded by his older siblings with a mixture of fierce protectiveness and occasional bossiness that he tolerated with extraordinary good humor. Maria, lying in the bed on the second evening after William's birth with David beside her, and the lamp low, and the house quiet around them, and the three children in the world now, James in his room, Clara in the crib that had been James's crib, William in the new cradle David had built, felt the fullness of it in a way that made the feeling she had named happiness in the spring of 1881 seem like a sketch for something more complete. "David," she said. "Yes," he said. "I need to tell you something." "Tell me." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the ceiling, at the familiar planes and knots of the timber. "I walked up that road 8 years ago," she said, "with nothing worth speaking of and no plan beyond finding honest work, and you opened your door and put me in the good room." She paused. "I have thought about that almost every day since, the way you did that, the way you just did it, as if it were the obvious thing." "It was the obvious thing," he said. "It was not obvious. Most men would have, it doesn't matter. The point is that you did it and it changed everything, and I have never thanked you properly for it." He turned his head to look at her. "Maria," he said. "I am thanking you," she said, "for the good room, for the fair wages, for trusting me with the accounts before you had any reason to, for the way you listened at Alina's grave, for the way you said I love you in the middle of a wagon road without ceremony, for carrying the ledger when I was pregnant, even though I told you not to." She paused. "For all of it." He was quiet for a moment. "You changed things too," he said. I was managing before you came. I was keeping the ranch alive and I was getting through the days. I was not," he found the words. "I was not alive the way I am now." She reached over and found his hand in the dark. "Then we are even," she said. "Then we are even," he agreed. Outside, the November wind moved through the yard of the Covington ranch, and the mountains stood in their ancient indifference above the land, and the cattle were quiet in the pasture, and somewhere in the house a child made a small sleeping sound and then was quiet again, and Maria and David Covington held each other's hands in the dark and said nothing more, because everything that needed saying had been said. The years that came after were the years of building, not the frantic building of the early time, when everything was being made from scratch, but the steady, confident building of people who know what they are making and are not in a hurry to be done. James grew from a boy who sat horses badly and argued about everything into a young man who sat horses beautifully and still argued about everything, but more intelligently, and who had, by the time he was 14, begun to demonstrate a genuine aptitude for both the ranch work and the financial side of the operation that made David's expression, when he watched his son working the accounts, one of the most purely satisfied things Maria had ever seen. Clara grew into herself with the fierce, particular energy of a girl who knows exactly what she is and is not interested in apologies for it. She could rope a calf by the time she was 9. She could also read Latin by the time she was 9, because Maria had found a retired schoolteacher in town who gave lessons on Wednesday afternoons, and Clara had decided that if there was a thing to be learned, she was going to learn it completely and immediately. She and her mother had a relationship of mutual respect and occasional blazing disagreement that was, at its core, a love so complete and specific that it needed the friction to express itself. William, the peaceable one, grew into a gentle and capable boy who was the person on the ranch that animals trusted most completely, and who had, by the time he was 6, a working relationship with the horses that the adults found slightly eerie and entirely wonderful. The territory became a state. Wyoming was admitted to the Union in 1890, and it came in with women's suffrage intact. Wyoming had allowed women to vote since 1869, and when the statehood conventions had tried to remove that provision, the women of Wyoming had made clear, in terms that could not be mistaken, that they were not interested in accepting second-class citizenship as the price of statehood. The provision stayed. Wyoming entered the Union as the first state in which women could vote. Maria, who had been following the statehood debates in the newspapers with the specific attention of someone who had a personal stake in the outcome, read the news of admission on a July evening on the porch, with the newspaper spread on her knees and David sitting beside her. She finished the article and set the paper down. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "It matters," she said. "It does." She thought about Independence, Missouri, about the years of keeping her father's books and having no formal stake in anything she managed, about the legal invisibility of women who were deceived by the men they trusted, about the way the world had been structured consistently and without apology to make it harder for women to stand on their own ground. "It is not enough," she said, "because it was a beginning, not an end, but it is something." "You have always known that," he said. "Yes," she said, "I have always known that." He reached over and took her hand. On the porch of their ranch in Wyoming, in the July evening of a state that had just decided, officially, that the women who had built it alongside the men had a right to say what happened to it, David and Maria Covington sat with their hands intertwined and watched the sun go down over the mountains they both loved. The good years accumulated. In 1891, James, at 12, began keeping the accounts alongside Maria, learning the system she had built from the chaos of 1878 and developed through 14 years of careful practice. She taught him the way she had been taught, by doing, with explanation, with the insistence that he understand not just the mechanics but the reasoning. In 1892, Clara, at 8, announced that she intended to become a doctor. This announcement was received by her parents with the particular quality of response that covers a multitude of internal reactions with a calm exterior. David's calm exterior covered approximately equal parts pride and worry. Maria's covered primarily pride and a fierce, private determination that if Clara wanted to become a doctor, she would have every possible tool to do so. The Wednesday lessons expanded. Books were ordered. The retired schoolteacher was replaced by a more rigorous instructor. William, at 6, was not interested in being a doctor or a rancher or, apparently, anything in particular. He was interested in the horses and the creek and a growing menagerie of injured animals he brought home with the regularity of a tide: a hawk with a broken wing, 3 orphaned rabbits, a coyote pup whose mother had been killed, which caused some tension with the ranch hands, but which William managed with a diplomatic instinct that astonished everyone. David looked at his youngest son, sometimes with the expression of a man who is not sure what he is looking at, but is certain it is something extraordinary. It was in the winter of 1893 that Maria found the letter. It arrived in the general mail on a January afternoon, addressed to her in a handwriting she recognized immediately after 15 years, with the same physical response she had once felt to a fire, an instinctive recoiling from something dangerous. Carl Whitmore had found her. She sat in the office with the letter in her hands for a long time without opening it. Then she opened it, because she was not a woman who avoided things she needed to face. The letter was not threatening. It was, in its way, worse than threatening. It was apologetic. Carl Whitmore, who was apparently now in Denver and apparently now a reasonable man or wished to present himself as one, had written to express his regret for what he had done 15 years ago and to ask, with what he seemed to believe was appropriate humility, for her forgiveness. He also mentioned, in the second-to-last paragraph, that he had heard she had done well for herself. Maria set the letter on the desk and sat very still for a moment. Then she called for David. She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it standing up, by the window, with an expression that traveled from neutral to controlled to something that was not quite anger but was its close neighbor. When he finished, he set it down carefully. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "Nothing. He wants forgiveness," she said. He wants me to tell him that what he did not matter, or that it has been resolved, or that I have moved past it in a way that absolves him of having done it. I am not interested in providing that." David looked at her. "I have moved past it," she said. "Everything that happened as a result of what he did brought me here, to you, to this life, and I would not change it. But that does not mean he deserves a letter that tells him he can feel better about himself." "You don't want to write back." "I do not want to write back," she said. "I want to put this in the fire and not think about him again." David looked at the letter for a moment. Then he picked it up and put it in the small iron stove, and they watched it burn, and that was the end of Carl Whitmore. "Are you all right?" he asked after. "Yes," she said, and she was, which was perhaps the truest evidence of how thoroughly her life had become her own. "I am entirely all right." He stood behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him, and the fire burned down to ash. The spring of 1895 brought a particular morning that Maria would return to in memory for the rest of her life, not because anything dramatic happened, but because it was simply perfect, in the way of moments that do not announce themselves as significant. She was in the kitchen garden, which had been expanded 3 times since that first spring and now ran the length of the south wall and around the corner to the east, planting the early peas in the fresh-turned earth. The morning was cool and bright, the kind of April morning where the sky was a color blue that did not seem entirely real. The mountains were beginning to shed their winter snow, the high peaks still white, the lower slopes going brown and then tentatively green. James was in the office doing the accounts. Clara, now 11, was inside at the table that served as her schoolroom on weekdays, working through a Latin translation that she had decided was too easy and was therefore supplementing with an anatomy text she had ordered from Chicago. William, at 9, was somewhere in the pasture with the horses, which was where he always was when he was not specifically required to be elsewhere. David came out of the barn and across the yard and sat on the low garden wall to watch her plant, which he did sometimes when there was a moment between the pressing demands of the morning. She kept planting. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The accounts for spring supplies," she said, "and the east fence, which Tom says needs the corner post replaced before the ground dries out. And whether the pea variety I ordered from the catalog is actually as cold tolerant as they claim, because if it isn't, I've wasted 20 cents. "Nothing else?" he asked. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was 52 years old and weathered and still lean, and the gray at his temples had spread considerably, and his eyes in the morning light were the same direct, honest gray-brown they had been on the day she arrived at his gate. "I was thinking," she said, "that I am happy, specifically happy, not in the general way. I was thinking about what it means to be standing in this dirt in this garden with this family in this house." He was quiet for a moment. "So was I," he said. She looked at him. "We were thinking the same thing. We generally do," he said, "eventually." She laughed, and the sound of it went out across the yard, and the mountain stood above it all, still and enormous and beautiful, and the peas were in the ground, and the family was in the house, and the ranch went on around them like a world that was entirely theirs. She reached over and picked up the hammer that was lying on the garden wall beside her planting bag, the same hammer she had carried 4 miles up a dirt road 17 years ago, its hickory handle worn smooth now by years of honest use, its head dark with age and work, and she drove the last stake into the ground for the pea strings. Clean. One blow. David watched her do it and did not say anything, and his expression was the one she loved best, the open one, the one that had stopped being guarded and started being present, the one that belonged entirely to this life and this morning and her. She set the hammer down. "Come have coffee," she said. "In a minute," he said. "I want to look at this for another minute." "At the garden." "At you," he said simply. She left him there and went inside, and the screen door swung behind her, and the morning went on in its ordinary, extraordinary way, James calling out a question about the accounts, Clara arguing a point about Latin grammar to no one in particular, William coming in through the back door with something in his hands that was probably injured and almost certainly going to become a permanent resident of the Covington ranch. David came in a few minutes later, and she handed him his coffee, and their hands touched, and the house was loud with their children and alive with the particular kind of organized chaos that is the evidence of a full life. And outside the April mountain stood in the light, and the peas were in the ground, and the hammer was on the garden wall. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was completely, wholly, and irreversibly right. Maria Garrison Covington, who had walked through a gate with nothing but her best dress and a hammer and the kind of fierce, honest heart that does not know how to be anything else, had made, by the work of her hands and the truth of her love, a life so entirely and completely her own that she could not imagine, standing in the kitchen of the house on the Covington ranch in the April morning of 1895, how she had ever lived any other way. She could not imagine it, and she did not try. She drank her coffee and called her children to breakfast, and the day began.